Okay, so welcome to the second event in this series, Interventions into Disability Politics. I'm really excited today to welcome our speaker for this evening, Ellen Clifford, who a lot of you probably already know. She's a disabled activist working with disabled people against cuts, but also working with Experts by Experience Commission on Security. She is the author of a really quite amazing book that I just only finished reading recently, The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare, and the Making of a Human Catastrophe, which was published in 2020 by Zed Books and won the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing that same year. She's also already working on her second book, which is going to be published with Bloomsbury in February 2024. And the working title of the book is Dispensable Lives, COVID, Disability, and Profit. So this evening, Ellen is going to be talking about what she calls the reinvigorated social model of disability. So I'm just going to hand over to Ellen now. I'm going to turn my camera off.
Thank you very much, Zoe. So before I start my talk, I should explain I won't be using slides. I didn't realise that it actually is now possible to screen share without blocking BSL interpreters. So I'm pleased you can, but I was also aware there are a number of blind attendees this evening, so slides would have had limited accessibility anyway, but I have prepared some that I can share with people if anyone is interested. The only other thing regarding access is interpreters and anyone else, Rona, please do shout at me if I go too fast. It is a very bad habit of mine. So, as Zoe explained, the theme for my talk this evening is a reinvigorated social model of disability. That's an idea that I took up in the final chapter of my book, The War on Disabled People. That final chapter looked to the future, and I gave my thoughts on how deaf and disabled people and our allies can continue to challenge growing oppression and resist worsening attacks on our living standards. Within that, I suggested the need for a reinvigorated social model underpinning disabled people's self-organisation and activism going forwards. When I came up with the title for the talk this evening, I really should have added a question mark at the end of it, because the question of whether we need a reinvigorated social model, or if we don't, and if we did, what it would look like, or whether we just need a whole new model, are still questions that are the subject of much debate and up in the air. What I presented in my book were just my ideas, discussed in collaboration with my co-thinker, Mark Dunk, who may or may not get here after work tonight. My thinking was always that what I presented should be discussed collectively, and for any development of a reinvigorated model to be done by deaf and disabled activists working in collaboration in the spirit of nothing about us without us. Sadly, the book came out quite a long time ago now, June 2020. And besides one online meeting funded by DPAC in July 2020, I haven't yet managed to take that work forward in terms of further workshops and collaborative work. But I do still intend to fundraise for that. But we also have this really good opportunity, thanks to Zoe and Luke, to this evening have some discussion. And I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody else's thoughts and ideas when I finish speaking. So what I'm going to cover is, what do we mean by a reinvigorated social model? Why I think we still need the social model, why I think we need to reinvigorate it, and my thoughts on what that reinvigorated model could look like as a starting point for discussion. So reinvigoration, well, that means to give new or renewed strength or energy to something. Barnes and Oliver addressed this question and concluded that it wasn't needed. Their reasoning was that the social model, which had been designed primarily as a tool for action, had already been the subject of far too much talking. Although the social model has been the subject of much controversy and criticism, I still think we need one. Firstly, because it's such a powerful liberatory concept. It's common for disabled people to describe the light bulb moment when they first come across the social model, when suddenly a lifetime of internalized oppression is lifted from our shoulders and our experiences up to that point start to make sense. Oliver and Campbell wrote that the social model enables disabled people to think afresh about themselves and their lives, instead of having to feel guilty or inadequate as a result of their impairment or their need for additional support. It transforms their understanding of their relationship with society, giving them new confidence and a sense of equality. And I've certainly seen that happen in practice, and the difference finding out about the social model can make to people's lives. The social model manages to explain disabled people's depression in a way that strongly resonates with disabled people ourselves. We see traces of that same outlook, a social model outlook, in earlier periods, before the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPS. For example, in the US, in the Great Depression, the League of the Physically Handicapped described their experiences of being excluded from the labour market as on top of their impairments, in a very similar way to how we explain the social model. Non-disabled people whose ideas are shaped by dominant narratives of disability sometimes find social model concepts more difficult to grasp. But in my experience, they very quickly make sense to disabled people themselves, regardless of education levels or communication access needs. For example, the self-advocacy organisation, People First, where I worked for a number of years, are committed followers of the social model. That very basic concept of there's nothing wrong with me is so powerful. Secondly, the social model has led to significant improvements in the lives of disabled people in Britain over the decades prior to 2010, with improvements here then influencing improvements in other areas of the world. Of course, after 2010, we then saw the deliberate retrogression of our rights and living standards. Even critics of the social model had to acknowledge this aspect of the social model in leading to real-world improvements. A.J. Withers writes about a plethora of positive changes in disabled people's lives. Without them, they explain, many disabled people would not have been able to access education, housing, transportation, the electoral system, or communities. Tom Shakespeare acknowledges the benefits of the social model approach and that it shifts attention from individuals. The social model turns dominant narratives of disability, whereby exclusion and lesser life chances are inevitable outcomes for disabled people, completely on their head. Shakespeare writes that this unprecedented move to turn traditional views of disability upside down appears several decades later to be one of the bravest and most transformative moves in the history of political thought. The social model exposes not only the brutality of capitalism in casting aside and denying the human potential of people who cannot be adequately exploited for profit, but also the possibility of an alternative through different forms of economic and social organization. On a practical level, I would add that we need a tool for social change based on unity and collective action now more than ever. As generations of gains in the lives of disabled people have been systematically snatched backwards over the past decade with the threat of more to come. Increasingly, disabled people are going back to the margins, unseen by the rest of society, unable to leave their homes, without support to communicate properly, such as access to emails and phone calls. If disabled people can't get to the places where policies and decisions about our lives are made, then non-disabled people will be speaking for us. And our position as second-class citizens, whose lives have lesser worth, will become ever more entrenched. The social model is well established within organizations and among groups and activists who identify as belonging to the disabled people's movement or movements. The social model has passionate adherents, and yet within the wider infrastructure of these movements, there isn't the capacity at the moment to properly educate disabled people with a fuller understanding of what the social model is and isn't. It is a criteria of being a disabled people's organisation, DPO, to follow the social model. Yet, in my experience, too many now recruit staff without checking they know the social model and without any internal systems for training or for embedding the social model within operational practice. I would argue that if there was an attempt to replace the social model with something new, DPOs would either completely ignore it, not having the capacity to even engage in the debate, or worse, a serious attempt to replace it could succeed in undermining the social model to the point that organizations, wary of being too political, would see this as an excuse to abandon even the pretense of fundamentally trying to change society. So I still think we need a social model, but that it needs to be reinvigorated. And this is for the following reasons. The social model was undermined by controversy right from the start, as critics began to present arguments against it, with claims such as the social model is wrong, made without putting anything that similarly resonated with disabled people in its place. It can be argued that this controversy opened space for the development of new models opposed to a social model approach. The most pernicious of these being the Waddell-Aylward biopsychosocial model, designed by scientists involved with the Department of Work and Pensions and funded by the American insurance giant Unum, to develop a scientific basis for a new type of disability assessment, which would effectively deny disability and relocate the problem within the disabled person. Not this time as a biological deficit, but as a mental one of negative attitudes needing to be fixed through forcing behavior change. This biopsychosocial model has been scientifically discredited in a paper by Tom Shakespeare et al., perhaps as Shakespeare's attempt to make up for his part in undermining the social model, but it still continues to be the model of disability that underpins welfare reform in this country. Meanwhile, numerous groups of disabled people have been discouraged from identifying under the social model due to use of the term impairment. Whereas they can identify as being subject to a shared oppression, they object to the idea that they have a biological or mental deficit, as is implied by the term impairment. This applies to deaf BSL users, people with mental distress, and autistic people. Such objections prevent unity and can cause tensions that hinder collective action and stop groups from working together, as I have sadly seen on numerous occasions. This situation, I would say, has not been helped by the lack of infrastructure and capacity within disabled people's organisations for understanding and discussing the social model of disability and principles that inform our practice. This has resulted in sometimes dogmatic and outdated interpretations of the social model that don't feel applicable to certain groups. Finkelstein commented that the social model had come to be interpreted in a rather sterile, formalistic way. In my view, a reinvigorated social model could quite easily address many of the controversies and concerns that have undermined it and continue to limit its impact. I would argue that on an activist level, at least, many of the criticisms and controversies could be put to bed in quite a straightforward way. One, by restating and making clear key aspects of the social model, such as how it was never intended to be a perfect theory of disability, but was designed as a tool for building unity and achieving social change. In my experience, these are ideas that people can get on board with. And once they see the role of the social model in achieving the social change they also want to see and want to fight for, they are able to overlook issues with some of the interpretations and use of terms and definitions. 2, I think we need to introduce a historic understanding to interpretations and application of the social model. And for example, separate out the demands made by earlier generations of campaigners from the model itself. AJ Withers, for example, is very critical of the focus that campaign groups such as UPS placed on winning disabled people's right to participation in the labour market, and the idea that this was the route by which to achieve equality. Withers links this employment focus with the historical materialism of leading UPS activists. The approach that UPS took was based on the premise that advancements in technology would lead to improvements in the lives of disabled people. History has shown us that technological advancements have not been used to change the position of disabled people within society. However, that doesn't make the social model itself wrong. 3, the social model of disability does not and has never denied pain or distress directly caused by illness or impairment, and has never discouraged disabled people from talking about our impairments and exploring our mind and body identities. Oliver himself, for example, did work specifically on spinal cord injuries. It's just that the social model of disability is concerned with disabled people's oppression. It's not concerned with impairment. 4, lastly, I think we need to find ways to resource greater dialogue between disabled people who identify under the social model and deaf BSL users. I think that too often non-deaf people can underestimate the importance of identifying as a linguistic minority and securing access to communication support and to language. So in terms of what a reinvigorated social model of disability might look like, I have 3 main thoughts. As already mentioned, emphasising its role as a tool for collective action. Whilst raising awareness of the social model and disability equality workshops run for non-disabled people are important, I think activists need to interrogate our own practice with a focus especially on how we build greater unity and promote action underpinned by rather than replaced by theory. I think a really good example of this, not to embarrass them, but is the work that Luke and Zoe have been doing with, for example, this series of talks in rebuilding links between academics and activists. And I'd like to thank them for the work that they've been doing around that. Secondly, which I'll go into more detail on next, for us to start talking about the social model of disability in opposition, not to a medical model, but to an individual model, or to a core ideology of individualism. 3, lastly, to develop a social model of impairment, which I will come to last. In The Politics of Disablement by Mike Oliver, first published in 1990, he explained how the ideology of individualism informs policies and practices that oppress disabled people. Karl Marx wrote, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas." The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci built on this idea with what is known as his theory of cultural hegemony. He saw a difference between countries like Russia before the revolution, where the state kept its power over people by force, and more developed capitalist countries like Germany, where the power the ruling class has over people is more complicated. Here, the network of organizations and institutions that make up civil society promote ideas that support the status quo and keep the ideas of the ruling class dominant. As disabled people, we have first-hand experience of how the dominant ideas in society can be at odds with our realities and truths. Dominant ideas about disability show disabled people in a negative way. For example, as passive victims, dependent on the kindness of non-disabled people to survive and nothing to contribute to society. Or as benefit scroungers who could contribute to society by working and paying taxes like everyone else, but we choose not to because we're lazy. Such negative ideas are promoted through civil society, for example, by charities and the media. Hegemony is more than ideology. To fit the definition of hegemony, ideas must be taken on unconsciously and unquestioningly by the populace. As disabled people, we experience how it is taken as common sense within society that disability means having something wrong with you. It's also common for non-disabled people to view disability issues as something marginal to society and irrelevant to them. They're frequently surprised to find out, for example, that we make up a minimum of 22% of the population in the UK. Mike Oliver attributed the success of his book, The Politics of Disablement, to the section he wrote in it about hegemony and disability. He took Gramsci's idea of organic and arbitrary ideologies and renamed them core and peripheral ideologies to make clear how they're interdependent and interrelated. His analysis of hegemony and disability was that the disabled people are oppressed by a core ideology of individualism underpinned by the medicalisation of disability and personal tragedy theory. He presented the social model of disability as opposed to, and a direct challenge to, this ideology of individualism. In practice, disabled people's organisations, DPOs, have always talked about a social model opposed instead to a medical model. Oliver spent a great amount of time repeating that to him, there is no such thing as a medical model, only an individual one. However, the idea of a social model versus a medical model is ingrained within many DPOs. I don't think, though, that it would take us too far, that it would be too much of a stretch to go back to Oliver's original analysis within an attempt to bring the social model up to date and increase its relevance to more groups of disabled people. The benefits of this would be a more accurate understanding of hegemony and disability, and of the relationship between disability and capitalism, while also building the opportunity for greater identification with the social model from among different groups of disabled people. For example, with campaigners with energy-limiting chronic illness who are fighting to be medicalised and for their illnesses to receive medical diagnoses. I also think that thinking in terms of an individual model can make it easier to spot when new policies and professional-led interventions are anti-social model while hiding behind progressive rhetoric. So, asking the question, does this policy or intervention seek to change the individual or to deliver solutions that will enable them, as they are, to enjoy greater participation in society? Beresford identifies both the recovery model in mental health and normalisation theory as reinforcing oppression while also rejecting a medical model approach. They are both grounded in improving the life of the individual, but by helping them to better fit normative standards, and in so doing, to cease needing support. In a paper I did for a conference organised last year by Zoe and Luke on disability ideologies and COVID, I developed this idea further. I proposed building on Oliver's identification of core and peripheral ideologies and developing an understanding of how peripheral ideologies change and emerge at different times depending on changing conditions, and with what approach is most effective for upholding that core ideology of individualism within those conditions. I think we can view the medical model, the charity model, the recovery model, the biopsychosocial model, the normalization principle, and eugenics as peripheral ideologies and as different manifestations of that core ideology, underpinned by narratives that also change according to circumstance, such as personal tragedy theory, social valorization theory, and the superhuman versus scrounger narrative. I also suggested that through COVID, the medicalisation of disability took on a new and sinister aspect, underpinned by a narrative of disabled people's lives as dispensable that gained prominence during the pandemic. So lastly, a social model of impairment. Critics of the social model have identified how the term impairment is not appropriate as a description of a number of groups of people who nevertheless experience disabling oppression. For example, deaf BSL users, people living with mental distress, people who are neurodivergent, and people with chronic illness. In a broad sense, we're talking about non-normative bodies and minds that include people with illness, people with impairment, and people who are different. I therefore proposed, as part of a reinvigorated social model of disability, to develop a social model of impairment. This was something that Barnes and Oliver referred to as being useful, but nobody so far has developed a social model of impairment with which we are, on an activist level, familiar with, at least. A social model of impairment should reflect the heterogeneity of bodies and minds of all the people who experience disablement. Mark Dunk has posited a social model of impairment whereby impairment refers to material deficit experienced by those who are non-normative. Such a definition of a social model of impairment would allow us to keep the term impairment and keep it simple, and I'd like to see him developing that idea in the future. I think that developing a social model of impairment would complete the picture that was started with UPS and Oliver and the social model of disability. That was a time when the disabled people's movement was dominated by people with physical impairment. In practice, DPOs and disabled people-led campaign groups following the social model have long operated as pan-impairment, and activism after 2010 in particular has been notable for greater inclusivity of previously underrepresented groups. A social model of impairment would, in this sense, bring the social model of disability up to date. As Carol Thomas stated in 1999, and as cited by Steve Graby in his excellent paper, To Be or Not to Be, I'm just finding the right page here, sorry, To Be or Not to Be Disabled, Autism, Disablement and Identity Politics. It is possible, without contradiction, to make a conceptual distinction between impairment and disability, reconceptualize the latter as a form of social oppression, understand that bodily variations classed as impairments are materially shaped by the interaction of social and biological factors and processes, and appreciate that impairment is a culturally constructed category which exists in particular time and places. There's plenty of work that we could draw on in developing a social model of impairment, particularly from the field of neurodiversity, where much work has happened in exploring the relationship between neurodiversity and the social model of disability. I believe that this would represent an extremely exciting and timely development, and that a social model of impairment has even greater potential than a social model of disability to challenge that core ideology of individualism. In that, whereas a social model of disability can be understood as finding ways for people with deficits to be better included in society through better organisation, by adding a social model of impairment, we can challenge the very concept of individual deficits themselves, and in so doing, expose a fundamental alternative to our current socioeconomic structures and the oppression that flows from them. So, so that's me. So you'd be pleased to know I can shut up now. I've just seen in the chat Steve saying that I've referenced a 10-year-old conference.